for the over 5.3 million Venezuelans fleeing massive economic and political turmoil. Since 2015, being designated as migrants instead of refugees has a life-changing impact. Take the case of Colombia, the country hosting an estimated 1.8 million Venezuelans, making it
This is the largest number in the region.
While Colombian President Iván Duque has spoken at length about the solidarity needed between Colombians and their Venezuelan brethren,
nosotros sabemos hacer de la fraternidad también un sentimiento de solidaridad.
the reality on the ground is quite different. As a signatory of both the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the 1984 Cartagena Declaration, Colombia committed itself to extending the definition of a refugee to persons who have fled their country because their lives have been threatened by circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. And the obligation to protect refugees, granting them the same rights as nationals with regard to approximately 17 rights, the most fundamental of which are identity papers and travel documents that allow them to travel outside the country, access to education, access to public relief and assistance, the right to engage in wage-earning employment, and the right to access housing. States bear the primary responsibility for determining refugee status. That means that the Colombian government is meant to undertake this responsibility as a signatory of the 1951 Convention. Fast forward nearly 36 years since the Cartagena Declaration was signed, and the reality is less than hopeful. Despite fleeing,
Una tragedia humanitaria.
With more than 19,000 murders last year, Venezuela is considered one of the most dangerous places in the world.
according to Mauricio García Durán, former director of the Jesuit Refugee Service in Colombia, out of approximately 1.8 million Venezuelans in Colombia, only 57 have received refugee status. That means that although Venezuela is a country where people's lives, security, and freedom are threatened by political turmoil and a crippling economic crisis, which seriously disturbs the public order,
Esa situación caótica es la que ha detonado esa crisis migratoria.
Venezuelans entering Colombia are only recognized as brothers,
Nuestro deber es estar ahí para el hermano venezolano.
Hermanos venezolanos.
The Venezuelan brothers.
never refugees, by the government. This places Venezuelans at great risk, without a right to government protections, basic services, and employment. They are at a constant risk of deportation and dependent on infrequent or irregular aid from NGOs and locals. How does this compare to the more well-known case of Syrians? Venezuela is second only to Syria in terms of displacement, but estimates from the UNHCR show that if current trends continue, there could be as many as 6.5 million Venezuelans living outside of their country by 2020, far surpassing the speed of displacement seen in Syria, with 6 million Syrians forced to flee since 2011. Despite these harrowing statistics, funding to aid this crisis has been dismal. On a per capita basis, the international community has spent $1,500 to help each Syrian refugee versus just $125 per Venezuelan refugee, making it the worst and most underfunded refugee crisis in modern history. So why would they receive radically different amounts of aid? In mainstream media and political discussions, Syrians are readily recognized as refugees, while Venezuelans are not. For example, President Ivan Duque actively avoids calling them refugees, but refers to Syrians as such.
Let me ask you, the 1.2 million refugees.
1.2 million migrants, Syrian refugees.
However, since 2015, the largest host of Syrian refugees, Lebanon, has refused to allow the registration of refugees, but continues to receive international aid on the basis of addressing a refugee crisis. Lebanon is not a signatory to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, and as such, does not have a legal obligation to designate people as refugees. However, from approximately 2011 to 2015, they relegated that responsibility to UNHCR. But starting in 2015, the Lebanese government decided that it would no longer allow UNHCR to officially register refugees. That means that we actually do not know the number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon since 2015. Despite the fact that according to international law, Venezuelans and Syrians are fleeing because their lives are in danger and they are unable to return without risk to their lives, both Lebanon and Colombia refuse to recognize their refugee status. And so, as Javier Ochoa, a refugees and migration analyst explains, this contradictory policy environment creates a refugee crisis without refugees. The lack of recognition denies refugees access to healthcare, education, employment, and during an unprecedented pandemic, even less access to regular humanitarian aid. But the hardest hit by these circumstances are women. They are not only disproportionately affected by these challenges, making up the majority of the displaced, but are at an even greater risk for unemployment, sexual and gender-based violence, and limited access to basic healthcare services than men, making these crises not only one of refugees, but also one of gender inequity. So to arrive at any meaningful solutions, we must reckon with the gendered nature of these crises.